Last time we had Asian's slow American cousin tell us about a cancer cure that doesn't cure cancer. This time we'll have someone tell us about a cause of cancer that doesn't cause cancer.
The spectral projection remote by analog dowsing is a device that is said to be able to project ghosts and spirits onto any TV screen. Now it's just a modified remote without batteries. It doesn't even have a flux capacitor. You may as well just go out and get a regular remote control or a fucking banana.
His arguments are not only really stupid, how very wrong, and idiots will buy that shit on DVD.
Ghost hunters and their damn toys!
Evacuate, evacuate, professional creationist.
Hello, my friends.
Evacuate, evacuate, professional creationist. Evacuate, evacuate.
Way to pink!
My name's Don Chapman. It's my privilege to be your host.
Welcome in hell.
You know, Origins is a forum where we take the evidence of science and we use it to validate the truth of God's creation.
A forum where you try to tweak science into validating your favorite fairy tale? Bad creationist.
Today we have with us Dr. Terry Mortensen.
Hi, Mortie.
And Dr. Mortensen has his PhD from the University of Coventry in England, where he studied the history of geology. And I think that's an amazing background to come to be with us today.
Cool! An authority figure that has... Wait, what? History of geology? So, you studied about the folks who were trying to study geology in the past? Whatever, I'll take it.
He's been on the staff of Answers in Genesis as a speaker since 2001. We're so honored to have you with us today, sir.
Answers in Genesis is not really an achievement, especially since that means that he was busy since 2001 with parroting Cantam's ideas instead of doing research. But hey, you should never judge a book by its cover.
Today we're going to talk about evolution, and we're going to talk about operation science and origin science.
Evolution? That guy's a geology historist, not a biologist. Why don't you talk about something connected to his field?
When we start talking about evolution and creation, here's the mantra that I always get from the other side. Well, you know, creation, that's religion, and evolution, that's science. How do you answer that?
Well, evolution is a testable explanation for the diversity of life, and it can be used to make testable predictions. That makes it science. Creation, on the other hand, is simply the belief that the universe and life originate from a divine being. It is believed, no matter if its explanations have been tested and proven false, or are not testable at all. That makes it not science.
Well, my answer to that is you've got a fuzzy definition of science, and you're not defining things carefully. When we really look at it, they're both similar.
Do you mean fuzzy as in, I don't like this position, therefore you got something wrong? Or fuzzy as in, your definition is too complicated, so I can't even follow you? And what do you mean by similar? One is based on evidence, and one is based on a Bronze Age myths collection.
You know, when I deal with evolutionists, it's this changing of definition of words that makes it hard to talk. Is that true?
Those pesky evolutionists. Talking to them would be just so much easier if they could just use a clear and orderly definition, like creationists have for the word kind.
That's exactly right. And I think there's two broad categories of science that we need to understand to be able to understand this origins controversy.
Let's ignore for a moment that what you think science is has not much to do with what it actually is. So, two categories you say. Let me guess. Evidence-based science and pseudoscience. Or maybe peer-reviewed science and hocus-pocus science?
That would be operation science and origin science.
Hey, having two nonsense categories isn't fair, you cheater.
Let's define these terms so that we can have a rational discussion here. And the scientific method is what we normally think of, and that is the use of observable, repeatable experiments in a controlled environment, that's usually in a laboratory, to understand how things operate or function in the present so that we can find cures for disease or develop new technologies. And so we sometimes call that also experimental science.
I make a guess here and assume you mean that we have to make sure our data is not compromised by influences we didn't take into account. So to fit your definition, operational science is what we can observe, test and verify repeatedly with the same outcome. Well, this here is the actual definition of science. But let's use yours for a second. We can observe gradual changes within species to adapt to their environment as well as speciation. We can cause mutations through experiments and we can pinpoint the cause and repeat the experiments with the same result. So evolution would still count as science due to your definition. And creationism, well, we cannot observe or test a creating force with will and personality, and we actually find a lot of evidence contradicting that hypothesis. So even due to your definition, creationism is not science.
Most of biology, chemistry, physics, medical research, engineering research, that's all in the area of operation science. How do things operate so that we can manipulate them?
Operational science seems to be nothing but economically valuable science. I mean, there are countless theories that allow us to describe the world around us, but we can't return them all into sandwich boxes.
We take a theory, we test it, it's repeatable, it does the same thing every time, so we know it's a fact.
Or to use more common terms, we set up a hypothesis, we test it, and repeat the testing. If the result is accurate, repeatable, and holds up under scrutiny, we explain the observed results with a theory.
Okay.
But in contrast, that kind of science is not going to answer the question how the Grand Canyon formed. Because you can't recreate it in the laboratory.
Whoa, hold on a second. What does evolution have to do with the Grand Canyon? Last I checked, the Grand Canyon was not alive. But just to make sure you don't accuse me of dodging the point, you can't recreate the discovery of a new species in the lab, and yet new species are discovered all over the world. Nor can you recreate star and planet structures, composition and movements in a lab. And yet you can study and predict them very precisely. The word observation is not in the definition to decorate the sentence.
It's a historical question. It happened in the past. Nobody was standing there to watch it, and so we got to try to figure out what happened in the past.
Are you implying that in order for you to accept that something happened, someone had to be standing there to supervise all the time? So, if you happen to come across a car in a ditch, that analogy sounds so familiar.
Do I have to use another car analogy? Don't you make me use another car analogy, mister.
Anyway, if you see the car in a ditch with its front wrapped around the telephone pole, you won't accept that there was a car running off the road unless you got an eyewitness telling you it did?
It also, operation science won't answer the question, is the body buried under the slab in the floor of Westminster Abbey Charles Darwin? You can't raise him from the dead and ask him. So it's a historical question, and for that, we need origin science.
You said that you accept testable and repeatably testable evidence from the labs, right? So how about this? We could just dig out the corpse and make a DNA test based on the genetics of his relatives. You know, like a paternity test?
Now, what is origin science?
Okay, well, I would describe origin science as using the legal historical method, which can be defined this way. The use of reliable eyewitness testimony, if any is available, and observable evidence to determine the past unobservable, unrepeatable event or events which produced the observable evidence we see in the present.
What do you consider reliable eyewitness testimony? How reliable is a Sasquatch observer or a victim of an alien abduction compared to a fellow creationist who tells you a car in the ditch hugged the pole as a result of a worldwide flood? Just asking.
So if I'm standing at the north rim of the Grand Canyon and I'm looking at the canyon, I want to know what happened in the past to produce those rock layers a mile deep and cause that huge hole in the ground. It's a historical question. And so I'm looking at the evidence in the present to reconstruct the unobserved past.
Oh, really? And how exactly do you do that? With sunglasses in the night, perhaps?
It's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses. Hit it.
You have just stated that as soon as we talk about the past, you go straight to some dumbass eyewitness instead of measuring and dating methods that can actually be checked and cross-examined. And talking about total darkness, if I were to take a shot in the dark, I would say your evidence is starting with G and ending with odd.
Okay, that makes sense.
It doesn't. Come on, Don, Chappie. Don't fall asleep on your own shrine and pretend like you paid attention.
And so we also call this historical science. And so much of geology, paleontology, archaeology, cosmogony, the attempt to reconstruct the history of the universe, and criminal investigation. Those are all historical or origin sciences. They're trying to reconstruct the unobserved past.
Investigation is historical science.
Investigation. So when you end up in court with the judge holding your paternity test and demanding that you pay child support, you deny its validity because it's historical science? I wonder if anyone ever won a case with that.
Now, it seems to me that the degree of certainty between these two kinds of science is very different.
That's because this first invented category is camouflage bogus and the other one is out of the closet bogus.
It is very different because our assumptions about the past and about the present affect our interpretation of the evidence as we seek to reconstruct the past.
Let's clarify one thing right away. When a scientist talks about assumption, what he means is that he assumes something that has been previously established. For example, if you make a paternity test, you assume the existence of DNA. The scientist doesn't mean that he misinterprets data to fit his confirmation bias. Real science, unlike yours, is never based on personal opinion, but on testable data that people can revise, repeatedly check, and if inaccurate, debunk at any time. If real science was based on eyewitness testimony, we would still try to cure the flu with leeches. You have a very poor understanding of actual science.
We all have a human nature, so what we assume, we naturally will look for evidence to validate.
Bible.
I'm not the Messiah! I say you are, Lord, and I should know I followed a few!
The reason why a believer and a non-believer can equally be successful in the specialized field of science is because the moment they enter the lab, they place their personal belief and interpretations in a corner and don't touch them before they leave the lab again.
That's right. And so no scientist goes out into the world with an empty mind. No. He has certain assumptions.
The only difference is that a dogma fanatic will project his assumptions on every stone he finds, while a genuine scientist gathers the actual data and adapts his assumption to the evidence.
We all wear glasses.
Right, worldview assumptions,
Lenses,
and those will affect what we see and how we interpret and reconstruct the past. They influence or control the questions we ask. An evolutionary geologist going into the Grand Canyon will never ask the question, could Noah's flood have caused what I'm looking at?
No,
it's not even on his radar.
Right.
Why not a tentacle lash from the spaghetti monster, or Zeus being angry at Poseidon? Or maybe invisible unicorns ran a hole into the ground? There shouldn't be anything on his radar, except maybe a sense of wonder, and hopefully an insatiable urge to figure out what is going on. The moment he is fixated on a specific cause, he eliminates a huge number of other more plausible explanations a priori, most likely also including the correct one.
But a creation scientist is taking the eyewitness testimony of God in the Bible about that event, and he's asking that question. Can what I see be explained by Noah's flood?
So what you're saying in a nutshell is that a creation scientist has a bias and the other guy doesn't. Do you even realize that this is not something positive? You rock your own boat there, mister.
So the evolutionist is probably thinking, how many billions of years did it take to make this hole?
Exactly.
And the creationist is saying, what here would validate the flood?
That's right, that's right.
Oh, isn't that sweet how Chappie tries to hide Mortie's total fuck up? I'll just try to pretend I didn't hear.
Second, they influence what we see in our research. No scientist goes into the Grand Canyon. He can't actually consciously look at everything he sees. There's some things that just go right by him.
Sure.
Okay, and the assumptions will influence a person and what they see.
I don't know how creationists handle research, but in general, scientists who go to study the Grand Canyon don't go there to research everything. They usually have a very specific goal. For example, a chemist might go there to try to figure out the exact composition of some stone layers. Also, you don't have just one guy going in looking at it once, and that's it. You have thousands of researchers documenting thousands of details and testing thousands of hypotheses.
They influence what data we collect. You can't write down everything you observe. You're mentally making decisions. Oh, that's important, I need to write that down. Oh, that's not important, I don't need to write that down.
As I said, to assume that one guy is supposed to check and write on everything is complete nonsense. Many people examine many different things, and what one eye doesn't see will be seen by another one.
And then the assumptions also influence or control our interpretations when we get back to our study and try to put together our notes and try to understand things.
First of all, if people look for specific details, they know pretty well what they're looking for. And although it can happen that important data is overlooked, the next scientist dealing with the thesis will find out about it and make his findings public. Science may be a slow process, but since it's self-regulatory, mistakes can be minimized and eventually eliminated. Also, don't forget that every paper gets peer-reviewed in the real world of science. In most cases, the people controlling the paper will point out right away that something is dodgy. Sure, the process is not perfect, but it generally filters out a good chunk of fraudulent results.
So those assumptions are really critical, and every scientist has assumptions.
You do realize that you're completely discrediting creation science right now, right? If evolutionary science really is invalid because people have personal biases, then so is creation science. It also isn't really true. To you, your assumptions may be critical because your salary depends on it. But for the majority of real researchers, the importance lies on accuracy, no matter if the hypothesis is proven or disproven during the experiment. As long as the data is accurate, correct, and repeatable, the experiment was successful.
Creationists do just as much as evolutionists. We're not just picking on the other side.
Whoa! Chappie, you just managed to pay attention and verbally backstab your guest. I'm impressed.
Both sides have assumptions.
That's right, but here's the problem, Don.
All right.
Most evolutionists aren't aware of their assumptions and don't acknowledge them.
That's right.
The creationists are right up front about our assumptions.
How could it possibly be more productive to declare that you're unwilling to change your mind right up front instead of at least trying to be open for evidence to the contrary? Does proclaiming your assumptions make you feel all warm and fuzzy inside? I mean, instead of feeling like a cash-driven manipulating leech, sucking the blood out of your God-blinded congregation, now you can at least be an honest cash-driven manipulating blood-sucking leech. That just makes it so much better. The fact that personal opinion can influence a scientist is not something unknown in the scientific community. Which is why, as I said earlier, there are several mechanisms in place to avoid getting biased data accepted. In contrast, there is no such thing as genuine peer review for creationism research. To the contrary, there is a huge effort to keep any sort of proclaimed evidence as far away as possible from people not belonging to your creation club.
So let's look at, and you hinted at this before, that those assumptions are kind of like glasses. And the evolutionist is using just his own human reason. He's denying the eyewitness testimony of the creator.
Eyewitness testimony of a creator? Fully relying on what people tell you is in and of itself already crazy. But you rely on your pastor's interpretation of a book translated and changed countless times in history and written by people who heard it third-hand from other people who themselves got it passed on for generations. Not only that, but you also believe that the eyewitness was not the one writing the book, but a character in the book. I am very sorry to break it to you, but storybook characters are not real-life eyewitnesses.
Whereas the creationist is using God's word, his eyewitness testimony about history, to understand the world. And so they put on those glasses and they look at the world and they try to reinterpret the world and to reconstruct that past based on those assumptions.
Do you even realize what you're doing right now? By saying they look at the world and try to reinterpret it based on those assumptions, you flat out state that they try to twist the reality to fit their own worldview. And that they do that by exercising the same crazy form of confirmation bias you claim to use yourself. You completely deprive them of every shred of credibility. That is the most severe condemnation of a creationist by a creationist I have ever seen.
Let's start by looking at some of the assumptions of the evolutionists. The first assumption is that nature is all that exists. Now, not every scientist believes that. There are people who believe in God, but most scientists do their work as if nature is all that exists. So if God exists, he's not on the radar, he doesn't come into the picture in terms of reconstructing the past.
Yes, believers and non-believers leave their dogma behind as soon as they enter the lab. We covered that. The less assumptions you have to make, and the better these assumptions are backed by facts, the better your description of reality gets. But there is something else that bothers me about this whole idea of yours. You made this entire monologue about the need to clearly define your terms, yet you suddenly place an apparently needed God in there, without giving us any proper definition of what it is, nor any evidence that supports its existence. And most importantly, why you have to add him to begin with. And while we're at it, what gives your divine version a pass when at the same time you discard the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, or Harry Potter without second thought?
In fact, back to our first point where we talked about creation is religion and science, evolution is science, they've really made a box where God isn't allowed in.
That is not really how science works. If God was testable, feasible, and evidence-based, he too would be in the scientist's box. Unfortunately for you though, this is not the case, and the universe works perfectly fine without this assumption.
Right, and that's a religious assumption.
Since when is the absence of an assumption a religious assumption? I don't assume that there is a monster hidden under my bed. Does that make me religious?
Yes.
Secondly, they assume that everything can and indeed must be explained by three things: time and chance and the laws of nature working on matter.
That is so pulled out of your, where the sun doesn't shine. Time only gets assumed if previously similar cases have demonstrated to be time-related. For example, if I have seen several pigeons taking weeks to hatch an egg, I assume that a pigeon egg will take weeks to hatch. Those so-called laws of nature are nothing more than descriptions of natural effects. And chance, well, chance simply means that an occurrence is not planned. There is also no must. If we observe phenomena that, for example, are not related to time, they will not get explained by time. It's really not that hard.
So if you have enough time, millions and millions of years, chance and the laws of nature, you can explain the origin of the Grand Canyon, the origin of the fossils, the origin of the creatures that became fossils. You can explain the origin of the solar system and galaxies and man.
I would like to rebut your assertion, but the problem is that you are challenging the strawman of a theory you made up yourself. But I find it odd that you dislike this method. After all, you seem quite fond of the idea that if you have enough time, like 6,000 years, inexplicable spooky magic, and the laws of a specific book, you can explain the solar system, the galaxies, and the whole of the Grand Canyon.
And if the explanation doesn't work, you just add a little more time.
That's right, that's right.
We didn't find the Higgs boson at 124 giga-electron volts, so I think we should try 124 giga-electron volts plus a couple million years. I don't want to do it.
If the explanation doesn't work, you replace it with an accurate one. But if you dislike change and improvement so much, there is this idea called creationism, where when the explanation doesn't work, you simply add a little more confirmation bias.
And those assumptions are really the religion of atheism.
Yes, sir.
Or the philosophy of naturalism. And those assumptions control virtually all of science today.
Religion of atheism? Is that something like religion of Santa Clausism? I grant you that the scientific method is based on the assumption that observable events are fully explainable by causes that we can detect and study. But that is simply a practical necessity, and it has shown over and over again to be successful. Science would stand still if instead of trying to figuring out a yet unknown phenomena, we would just say, God did it, and left it at that. If you dislike this approach so much, why not pull up your sleeves and provide some evidence that your method is more efficient? If it is, which I don't believe. And I mean real evidence. Testable, repeatable, and verifiable by every scientist of that particular field. Not the kind of obscured half-truth in your boss's museum.
When you say it controls all of science, it doesn't control you and it doesn't control me. But if you're talking about the institutions of our country, the universities, the schools, the science
journals,
research, the giving of grants, all of that works from this assumption.
Cash just doesn't pop out of thin air, but comes from sponsors who want to get their gain out of it. And about the education, last I checked, the schools get mainly controlled by politicians. In fact, if scientists had a say in the matter, the schools would probably get proper fundings and not decay mercilessly.
Right. This is the world
They have a monopoly.
controlling science.
Yes.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. Let me just give you a quote by a leading evolutionist that brings this real clear. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. See, even the way he's used the word science, he's
Yes.
already made it naturalistic.
That's right.
Okay? We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdities of some of its constructs.
That's amazing.
In spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life. In spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories like dinosaurs evolving into birds or monkeys evolving into people. Because we have an a priori commitment, a commitment to materialism. And he says, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
This quote is from Levintin's Billions and Billions of Demons, from the New York Review of Books, 9th of January 1997. I looked up that quote and the entire article connected to it, but frankly my English is not good enough to make sense of what this guy actually says. I'm also not too much invested in debunking someone's opinion. However, he was Jerry Cohen's PhD advisor, and Jerry had to say the following about this passage.
And I should correct this for anybody that's watching. A lot of people, including my advisor Dick Lewington, say that science from the outset refuses to consider the supernatural. You know, he's made a famous statement which is trumpeted by all the creationists. We cannot allow a supernatural foot in the door. Well, that's not the way it really works. The reason we exclude the supernatural these days from science is because it's never proven to help us understand anything. I mean, Newton had an explanation based on, you know, supernatural things, but it was explained naturally.
I recommend his latest book, by the way. It's called Faith versus Fact. Anyway, Levintin's or any other scientist's opinion has nothing to do with the actual work they do. Newton, for example, was a genius, but he believed in alchemy and other nonsense. His personal beliefs didn't have anything to do with his achievements as a scientist.
That's an amazing quote. He says he realizes what they're saying is absurd, it's illogical, it's impossible, but we're still going to stick with it anyhow.
Yeah, we cannot allow a God into our
We would rather
reconstructed.
believe the absurd than open the door for the possibility of God.
Right.
Let me get my head around this. While taking a quote and just leave it at that would have somewhat done the trick, you had to mutilate it up to the point where what you say is utter nonsense. Let me rephrase your sentence for a second. You consider the elimination of a priori unfounded ghost stories absurd, while putting in your Bronze Age deity of choice and discarding everyone else's is absolutely rational to you.
And so that is a religious view.
And that is not science.
No, that is philosophy masquerading as science.
Absolutely.
It's neither. It is a quote from a guy who had a word-salady way of expressing himself. Almost reminds me of Karl Barr.
This is called the Tower of Time and is found in standard publications. But I want you to know that there are data showing very clearly, and scientific research projects showing very clearly, that all of these layers, which presumably began about 600 million years ago, proceeding from the Paleozoic through the Mesozoic to the Cenozoic, all of these sedimentary deposits, which have been publicized as encompassing over 600 million years of time, and a progression in an evolutionary series, arriving ultimately at the best that ever was, the premier example of universal evolution, the mind of man. According to this evolutionary theory, these progressive systematic developments spell out evolution, in essence similar to or taken from the concept of Darwinism or neo-Darwinism. Now don't let me lose the audience.
Sorry, go on.
So out of that kind of thinking comes the evolution tree of life.
Stop. You started off by saying that we talk about evolution. Then you went from the Grand Canyon to some dodgy definition of the word science, and then to a quote mine. And now you jump back to evolution. Do you confuse your audience on purpose, or do you genuinely not understand what evolution actually is?
The different branches represent all the different plants and animals, and the evolutionists say all of those different plants and animals are related to a common ancestor.
So you do understand evolution. That is about the most accurate description I have so far heard from a creationist.
The first microscopic bacterium that popped into existence by chance.
Then again, you have absolutely no understanding of abiogenesis. Bacteria didn't just randomly pop into existence one day. They're just the next step after the self-replicating single-celled organisms. And an organism must fulfill most or all 7 criteria to be called life. That does not mean that the organisms didn't have predecessors. It simply means that the predecessors did not meet all 7 criteria and are therefore not called life due to our definition. If we look, for example, at a virus, it can't reproduce by itself but needs a host for it. Therefore, it doesn't count as life. That does not imply that a virus doesn't exist.
On an Earth that formed by chance, in a solar system that formed by chance over millions and millions of years.
Yeah, right. Because some invisible guy poofing into existence and turning a handful of living creatures into countless species and numbers within 4,000 years is totally more plausible.
So it flows right out of that naturalistic, atheistic worldview.
That hurts my brain. I don't even know where to start. First off, If you talk about the tree of evolution, why are you throwing in abiogenesis, or rather your hilariously wrong understanding of it, planet formation, and the solar system? Second, the origin of life were not bacteria, and they did not pop into existence by chance, but they were themselves a later step of natural selection. And if we go completely into abiogenesis, the first molecules were a result of chemical reactions, not random chance there either. Third, with all the planets and solar systems we have, is it so illogical for you to think that there are other forces involved than chance? Something along the line of maybe
Gravity, you fucking retard!
And fourth,
in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth.
Sounds quite like stuff getting popped into existence to me, but for some reason when you think others believe it, that's nuts. But when it's your own holy book telling you so, then it's certainly totally sane. You cannot have the cake and eat it, Mortie. That goes against the divine law of gluttony.
Okay, that's the evolutionary assumption. What about the creationist assumption? What are our glasses?
Oh, I like to call this the microbe to microbiologist theory for the origin of life, or from goo to you via the zoo.
Okay, before we continue, let me address my audience here for a moment. Guys, you are the main reason I enjoy making these videos. Your comments and your presence are priceless. But I always feel like making videos for some invisible crowd. So recently I sneaked around my subscriptions a bit, and I saw a couple of channels among you with very nice content. How dare you subscribe to me in all secrecy and deny me the pleasure of watching your videos? You know who you are. I have, with your absolutely consenting silent permission of course, enrolled every single one of you, my precious viewers and subscribers, into my Reptoid Illuminati hacker army. And today I will send you off to execute my vengeance. In the outro or in the description below, you will find your victims. Attack them with views, comments, likes, and if they were very naughty, with subscriptions. Also say hi from me.
Okay, let's look at the creationist. He doesn't start with those naturalistic assumptions. He has a different starting point. And the first one is that the eternal, good, all-knowing, all-powerful, holy God exists, and He created everything else.
In short, let's drop the "we assume the world exists and can be measured" and instead add "there is a sky daddy and he did it." That sure is an improvement.
Nature is
not
all there is.
In the beginning, God.
That's right. Nature is not all there is.
No.
Listen, Mortie. If you assume that nature is not all there is, then get your white coat out of the garage, free your lab from spiderwebs, put yourself to good use, and come up with a method to objectively detect whatever else there spooks around here. Even ghost hunters are more thorough than you.
Nothing.
Second assumption is that God's perfect word, the Bible, is the eyewitness testimony that enables us to correctly interpret the observable evidence to understand the origin and history of the creation.
It would be bad enough if you took just eyewitnesses. But you make it even worse by taking a book that has been written by God-addicted people. It's like asking a fan of a singer who wrote a biography based on a single concert he saw from the 10th row if that singer had a hiccup 10 days earlier.
Now, my son's a sheriff's deputy. If he finds a dead body in the living room of a house, he has to try to reconstruct what happened in the past to produce that. And if he's a good cop, he's going to go talk to the neighbors and see if there are any eyewitnesses to help him understand the evidence that he's looking at.
And God's Word does that for us.
And God's Word is that eyewitness testimony.
Yeah.
No check on the body, no DNA test, not even determining the cause and time of death. There are many cases being solved without a single eyewitness nowadays. And what if the eyewitness totally saw an oversized cockroach eat the victim? What then? Did your son ever even get close to solve a crime? But then again, chances are your son maybe is a decent cop and you just never asked him how real investigation works. Just like you never asked a biologist what real evolution is.
And so in terms of the origin of living things, in Genesis 1, God says that He created the first plants and animals and sea creatures and birds.
So due to your book, birds and sea creatures such as fish are not animals?
After their kind. That phrase appears 10 times in Genesis 1.
And yet, in spite of that, for some reason, kind still can't get properly defined until to this day.
And so God is saying He made distinct kinds to reproduce after their kind. He said the same thing on day 6, the land animals. And so He created mankind. But He didn't create all of those people on day 6. He created Adam and Eve.
Right. From nothing, he went to 2 adults who can walk, talk, eat, and communicate with snakes without any preceding learning process? Yeah, that sure sounds reasonable.
And in the genetic code of Adam and Eve was all the information for producing all that variety of skin color and eye color and hair color. That's all mankind. We're all one race descended from Adam. God created the cat kind. He didn't create each of those cats on day 6. He created the cat kind with the genetic potential in the DNA to produce that variety.
So while a 4,000-year speed mutation from a common feline ancestor to a cat, a tiger, a lynx, and a lion is perfectly fine, a slow, long, gradual change from a not-so-different ape ancestor to a chimp and a human is absolutely impossible? Talking about double standards.
So God built in variation into the kinds, but not the ability to change from one kind into another.
You still haven't defined kinds. So not only is it impossible to verify whether or not we can separate all life on Earth into kinds, but we also can't find the so-called limits of those kinds because we have no clue what kind actually is.
The modern scientific word for kind would be...
Wow. You did not ask that right now, did you? That is just the perfect backstep question. The king of all remotely possible screw-ups you could possibly make.
Well, creation scientists have been studying that question. It's very clear that except for Homo sapiens, man, it's not at the species level. Okay. In most cases, it's not at the genus level of scientific classification. It's probably at the family level with plants. In some cases, it might even be at the level of order.
Okay, we have established what kind is not. Can we now please move on to what kind actually is? How do you determine kinds? Why are they in some cases on a species level and in some cases on a genus or higher level? And what exactly are the criteria for fitting into one and the same kind?
So God built a lot of genetic variation within the kind, but not the ability to change from one kind into another, which is what evolution is saying.
Hey, you still owe us a definition. You can't just not define a kind and then make all sorts of weird assumptions about it. Also, the evolutionist doesn't claim one kind turns into another because the people you call evolutionists don't use the term to begin with.
That's a really good answer.
No, it's not.
So, I like to call it, in contrast to the evolution tree of life, the creation forest of life.
May the force be with you.
Each tree is a different kind of plant or animal, and God built into those original kinds that He created supernaturally the genetic information in the DNA to produce variety within their kind, but not the ability to change into a different kind.
So, your answer to how you think it could be possible for a cat to turn into a lion but not into a rat is God did it? No specification, no evidence, no, I don't know, example of what part of the DNA tells those cats where to stop or something? Just God? Well, at least you're being honest.
And so they produced variety up to the flood, 1,600 years later. And then after the flood, creatures could produce variety within their kind. But one tree doesn't change into a different tree. Each kind stays distinct, only producing variety within its kind.
You assume that within 4,400 years or so, from Noah's flood to now, a handful of animals populated the entire Earth. That one pair of cats could produce enough offspring to turn into panthers, lions, tigers, cheetahs, leopard, lynxes, pumas, and so on. And that in such huge numbers that it would make a modern cockroach blush in comparison. And yet you find it utterly impossible for a human and a chimp who share about 95% and more of their DNA to have a common ancestor?
So you have the evolution tree of life where everything is descended from a common ancestor, and the creation forest of life where they're distinct.
It's all fine and fun that you think it happened that way, but if you want others to believe it, it would really be helpful if you could provide some, evidence. Or at the very least some details of how you expect your ideas to work.
All right, Dr. Mortensen, we have to take a break. When we come back, we want to see the implications of this and what this means to us as God's people resting on God's Word. Don't you go away. This is very important, and we'll be right back.
Just a fucking clown. You know evil says they got the torches you for sin.
was busy parroting Kent Hovind. Wait, no, shit. He was busy parroting Kent Hovind, Ken Ham, just the same. He was busy parroting Kent Hams. Ken Hams. Sorry. Yeah, it's your own fault. It's because you're always deep and candy.
I know. Kent Hams? Ah, fuck.
Should I say Mr. Hams? Drive away, drive away, drive away, drive away, drive away. Is this guy driving backwards? Real side. You made this entire monologue about clearly.
Take it rest. Don't get your lungs all up in your.
Where's the camera?
Huh?
Oh, I see the camera.
Yeah, I guess it is hard. Sorry about how exactly I position it and where I do it and what it means.
Perfectionist.
Yeah.
And sleep on your own shrine and pretend like you paid attention. No, sit and move the hat.
It's
not doing enough?
Did I look fat right there? Just to make it like force right, just in case. Alright.
First of all, if people look for specific details.
Just making sure.
Yeah, but you get like all aggressive about it.
Yeah, but that's because I'm a man and I have like testosterone.
I totally leave that in, by the way.
Shit.